In September of 1975, two divers were working in the North Sea, doing a special type of diving known as saturation diving. Their job was to make a relatively short dive to 390 feet, or 120 meters, and untangle rope that had gotten wrapped around the guidepost of a piece of machinery called a blow-up prevent. This is a specialized piece of equipment used in oil and gas drilling that's crucial to keeping the pipeline operational. Now, in case to miss the last diving gone on video, when commercial divers need to spend long periods of time underwater or do exceptionally deep dives, it's impractical to just scuba dive down regularly. Even for dives that are only moderately deep, a decompression time makes it entirely impractical. Instead, divers will descend in these metal chambers known as dive bells. They'll actually live in these chambers and then exit either through a hatch or drop down out through the bottom when they need to work. These bells are equipped with beds, food, washrooms, and all the equipment they need to live for sometimes up to a month at a time. Then once the job is done, they only need to do one long decompression when the dive bell is brought up instead of one after every dive. This work to decompression ratio is just way more practical. After the two men were finished their job for the day, they were hoisted back up to about 310 feet, or 94 meters of depth, where they would then enter a small underwater complex. This was their living quarters for the job, which offered them just a little bit more space than a traditional bell. This complex was actually composed of three separate chambers. First was the bell, then on the other end was their living space, and then in the middle of those two chambers was a small chamber just used to transfer between the bell and the living space. At about 9:50 p.m., the bell made contact with the transfer chamber, which the divers then sealed together. These two metal rings look almost like the openings of a front-facing washing machine connected together. Once these two rings were connected, an attempt was made to pressurize the chamber to equalize it with the transfer chamber, but as gas started getting pumped in, a small leak was detected somewhere along the rings. The divers then disconnected the two chambers, cleaned the surfaces of the rings, and then reconnected them. This isn't uncommon. Any dust or debris that gets in between can create an imperfect seal, which can then cause a leak. After the two chambers were reconnected, they tried to equalize the pressure once again, which seemed to work at first, so they started moving him into the transfer chamber. As the two divers moved inside the transfer chamber actually started to leak once again, but rather than go through the whole process of disconnecting and cleaning the rings again, the supervisor told the men to just go into their living space. This would protect them from further pressure loss, and because the transfer chamber and living space were drying, they generally weren't any issues sealing back set of hatches. This is also all monitored by a supervisor who's above surface, either on a boat or the rig itself. Once they were inside, he had them lean on the door, and then he pumped in a little bit of helium gas to seal the door. On the surface, the supervisor has an array of gauges and valves to adjust and monitor conditions inside the chamber. The way these are set up is that each chamber has its own separate gauge, but they can also be reconfigured to monitor the other chambers as well. This gives them a series of backups in case of some malfunction with any single gauge, but more often than not, just a single gauge was used out of convenience. So as the men move through the chambers, the supervisor will just switch the gauge to the section in at the time to monitor the pressure. After he injected the helium into the room, the door was sealed correctly, but he hadn't changed the gauge from the middle chamber to the living space. This meant that to him, it seemed as though the chamber was still losing pressure, and thinking that it was still losing pressure, he started pumping tons of pure helium into the space. But instead of sealing the door, the room was now being pressurized like crazy. This went on for several minutes before he finally realized the mistake he made, and when he finally realized, the living space had been pressurized to almost double what it was supposed to be. This rapid compression, combined with the high thermal transfer of helium gas and the high humidity in the chamber, caused the temperature inside to go from 32 Celsius to 49 Celsius, or 90 Fahrenheit to 120 Fahrenheit, with almost 100% humidity. This would have been like being inside an oven, and because the humidity was so high, the men's ability to sweat to cool themselves off was severely reduced. They frantically tried to open the hatch door, but because of how pressurized the chamber was, it was impossible. And for some other unknown reason, the supervisor couldn't relieve the pressure inside the room either once he realized his mistake. In an attempt to find some relief from the heat, the divers pulled their mattresses from their beds and lay down against the cool aluminum. Finally, another diver was sent down to manually relieve the pressure and open the chamber, but by the time he got inside the transfer chamber and looked through the porthole, the men were unresponsive. In the few hours it took to reach them, tragically, the men had died of hyperthermia or heat stroke. This was the first recorded case of saturation diving death due to overheating. Typically, sat divers deal with extreme cold of the ocean floor and are often at risk of becoming hypothermic. It's for this reason that chambers are kept as warm as they are in the first place. So between the already warm chamber and the series of mistakes, the men were cooked alive inside their living quarters